Welcome to the Dirt Deed Conversations. My name's Andy Clark and I'm here today with Mark Krstic, who is the Business Development Manager of the AWRI, or the Australian Wine Research Institute. So thank you for joining me today, Mark.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, it sounds like a boring title these days, doesn't it? My passion's viticulture, just so you know, right? Business development doesn't sound so flash, I reckon.
So essentially, we're cozied up here on Mark's couch. It's a bit wet outside, so we're going to stay inside. But look, Mark, can you just explain to me what the Australian Wine Research Institute is and a little about that?
Yeah, no worries. Well, it's interesting. If you go back to the history of the institute, basically it was started in the early 1950s through an idea that no one in Australia really was doing any specific wine research. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the CSIROs or the State Departments of Agriculture at the time were probably very focused on kind of those agronomy things, you know, growing things in vineyards or, you know, wheat and all those sorts of things. And there was a real lack of kind of that chemistry, microbiology experience, and especially in and around sort of fermentation and winemaking and those sorts of things. So a group of industry people actually got together and they actually started the Australian Wine Research Institute in 1955. It was only pretty small at that stage. It was only, you know, really a handful of people, and it was started with a grant that came from industry, and and sort of matched a little bit from government as well. And it really kicked off a lot of, I guess, primarily it was around chemistry and also, you know, the microbiology, the fermentation stuff and whatever. And it's really grown. I mean, you know, today we're 120 people. We're a unique institute. We're not actually funded, if it makes any sense. We're not a government entity. We're not a university. You know, we're a limited by guarantee company. So that's great because it gives us a lot of focus on, you know, really making sure what we tailor for the industry is really focused, and, you know, really we're delivering all those sorts of things where, you know, universities or government departments have their own bureaucracies and so forth, and, you know, they become a little bit top heavy around trying to be, you know, nimble and agile for industry. So it's a really good group of people. They're really passionate about what they do. You know, it's not just fermentation and chemistry now. There's sensory on top of that. There's engineering. We've got a whole group of people who are dedicated kind of, you know, technical extension experts. You know, we've got like I said, just a whole bunch of people doing the new gen science, things like metabolomics, genomics, and managing, you know, really large data sets that come with those sorts of new areas of science as well. Yeah.
And so you're taking, essentially, you're looking at the science from the ground up, from the vine, from the soil, all the way through to the finished product.
Yeah, look,
in the bottle.
We've traditionally been probably more at that post-farm gate area, you know, if you go back in our history. But what we do now, we have a lot of interest in what happens in the vineyard, and we find what happens in the vineyard shapes a lot of what you see in the bottle too, obviously. So yeah, we've got a lot of people now with specialties in viticulture and those sorts of things, and really bringing it back to the soil and the vineyard and those sorts of things to see how that shapes what you see in the final bottle as well. So yeah.
So in terms of, you've got this industry-driven research centre based here in Australia. How does that fit on a global sense? So is this unique to Australia, or are there others that are out there?
Look, it's really quite unique to Australia. We have a kind of an ally, if you want to say. Sugar Research Australia is a bit of an ally. You know, they've got their own kind of industry-funded research centre too. So, you know, we share some sort of alliance with those ones, but we're really kind of unique because, you know, other research and development corporations in Australia are really funding other agencies to deliver their services. They're not, you know, a standalone kind of research institute themselves. So yeah, we're pretty unique on the global scale. So to have a non-government, you know, non-university kind of research centre that specialises in a kind of discipline is a little rare. There's not a whole lot of us out there in the world, and you know why? I guess the issue behind that is that you ultimately need funding, and Wine Australia, we have a great partnership with Wine Australia to make sure we get that funding to achieve those outcomes. But yeah, we're kind of a little unique, and we fit in terms of specialist centres around the world in wine. There's many of them, but there's only really probably a handful that we'd consider really world class. You know, there's really good people in some of these other institutes, but you know, we have alliances with the university in Bordeaux. We have an alliance with universities in Germany at Geisenheim as well. So, and others. We have people. We have 25 nationalities working for us. Okay, and we're always recruiting talent in science roles, but also having interns and senior researchers come and visit us and stay for 5, 6, 7 months and doing work there too. So we find ourselves really well connected globally into that grape and wine science area. And also, we are located in Adelaide. Sorry for that. But that has the power of, I guess, making sure you've got like a cluster of different researchers together in the same place is actually important for, some of the equipment that we have in our labs is worth many millions of dollars, and you can't duplicate that at other sites.
Oh, it's an amazing centre in Adelaide around the university and the Wake campus and the like, to see this one major hub of research and education and extension. It's a pretty impressive facility.
Yeah, and we're not a university too, Andy, so we link closely with, especially the University of Adelaide, but other universities in South Australia and in Australia and worldwide to, at host and co-supervise PhD students. So training that next level of talent coming through the industry is really important for us too, because we'll be drawing on that at some point to come and work for us in a more full-time capacity.
So I mean, the AWRI has been going since, was it 1955?
Yep.
What are some of the real successes that they've created for industry in that time? Yeah,
there's been a whole suite of these. Basically, I'll just run through some of them, but really, I guess the chemistry groups are really specialised in developing common measures of wine quality. The phenolic measures we have, understanding how we we measure those and understand the levels of anthocyanins in wines. That was done in the kind of the 60s and 70s. I guess we have a real focus looking also in the chemistry team, looking at taints and faults, but linking sensory with those particular chemical compounds. Now, there's been a real focus on obviously TCA, cork taint. There's been halophenols. There's been smoke taint in the last kind of 10 or 15 years. But that's been a real focus. But it's not just that. They're the kind of negative things. We're also really focused in on the discovery of flavour and aroma compounds that are responsible for some of those positive attributes as well. So the rotundone story with pepper.
That's a white pepper compound that's really prevalent in particular cool climate regions.
In certain Shirazes from Mount Langi.
Primarily.
Get the plug later for that. But also just lately, it's the apricot flavour or the stone fruit flavour in some white wines. So we've just had a PhD student, and also we've had a long-term staff member who's been a great analytical asset. She really knows how to drive these LCMSs, GCMSs, and all that sort of stuff. Who's just done a PhD through Bordeaux and discovered what causes that stone fruit character in wines. So really, like I said, there's a real lot of strength in that. Other things, just looking at other angles, the management of agrochemicals in our industry is, as you know, it's really important for market access and all those sorts of things, and that's critical to us and something we take very seriously. So on behalf of the industry, we've been managing that agrochemical database and managing, as we know, the dog book, which is basically a book that contains all the permitted agrochemicals that are allowed to be used in grape production for wine making purposes.
And from a grape producer, I think that's a really valuable tool to be able to know what chemistry you have up your sleeve at any given time of the year. It's very clearly laid out. It's probably the number one tool in the developing a spray program, really.
Yeah, we still print somewhere between 9,000 and 12,000 copies of that book a year, and it's now available on smartphone apps and whatever, and it's a benchmark. We're getting lots of inquiries from overseas about, hey, how can we do a similar thing? And even within Australia, looking, how can we adapt that for the table grape industry or other things as well. So there's a lot of interest in those tools, but we've also, I guess, developed a lot of simple to use, easy winemaking calculator tools and whatever over the years, and made those. Again, that's available via apps and bits and pieces, but lots of different things. Lots of really interesting projects. One, for example, that we've got at the moment is looking to validate the authenticity of wine. So understanding and where it's actually originated from and all that sort of stuff. So looking at rare earth isotope ratios in wines and linking that back to a database that you can use in practical terms to identify where wines have come from.
So it's essentially like tracking terroir in some way.
Yeah.
That's pretty impressive. So, forgive me. There's a lot of obviously it's a chemistry-driven industry, and so some of the terms and acronyms you've thrown out.
I make no excuses for this. Okay, it took me years to learn them. You've got to learn them in 5. Okay.
So as you say, it's taken you years to learn them. You've been in research for quite some time now.
Yep.
Who are some of the mentors you've had along the way, and how have they helped shape you in a professional sense?
It's a good question. I mean, I first started family, if that makes any sense. I think you got to look at your sort of family environment, and for me, agriculture runs deep in my veins, and so one of my, I guess, idols in my life is definitely my grandfather, and I'm lucky enough to still have him around. He turns 100 in October, but for me, watching him come up from that farming background, and basically he had his 2 hands, and he was able to do anything, and I guess it sort of shaped a lot of my inner being about who I am. Professionally, if I was going through university, I came from a grazing property farming background. So I was probably quite passionate about going down that path when I entered university. But it probably wasn't until I sort of had one of my professors was a horticultural science professor, and I found what he was teaching to be really, really interesting. I loved that whole mixture of chemistry and plant physiology and all that sort of stuff, and just how he tied that into commercial production and whatever was just fantastic. So I really changed through my university, and really took up a focus probably more on plant science and those sorts of things, and obviously into viticulture.
Because you did
I did an ag science degree, yeah.
And you did a PhD in forestry.
Yeah, I did a PhD more in forestry, plant physiology. So it was in nursery production of pines and those sorts of things. So it was a bit of a change to then end up in viticulture, and then so that was heading into there, and then through my when I got to the end of my PhD, I actually applied for a job in carrot research in WA. And ended up working in grapevine physiology in Merbein, which is near Mildura, for those that don't know where Merbein is, at the famous CSIRO research centre there. So, and then when I got to CSIRO, so moving into viticulture, I guess I really have to thank probably Peter Klingliffer initially. So, Peter at the time was just at a really high energy. He was really passionate about what he was doing in viticulture. And I really loved the breadth that he had, and the idea that this sort of field could take you all around the world. There was a real passion and group of people that it could be around the world. So that was definitely a thing. But in terms of, I guess, leadership skills as well, I did my postdoc at CSIRO for 3 years, and then I went across to work for the department. And I was really lucky to have a couple of old blokes, Keith Lehman and Greg Buchanan, who, I don't know what they saw. Maybe they saw a bit of potential in me, I don't know, but really kind of just were happy to let you grow, and they gave you responsibility beyond your age to go and do things, and that was really good at that time when you're in your kind of mid to late 20s and sort of not really sure about life at that stage anyway.
It's when you know enough to realise that you actually
you're dangerous.
You don't know enough.
So it's been good to go down that pathway, and then other ones for me. So when I left the department and really went in with in my GWRDC roles, working with that sort of role there, just interacting with really high level people in industry. Like for me, I still have a really good network with Jim Caddy and people like Terry Lee. So Terry Lee used to be the director of the Australian Wine Research Institute up until 1993. I think for a period of about sort of 13 or 14 years, and I still see Terry on a regular basis. And for me, I just love his confidence and what he brought to those roles too. Really good.
Yeah, great. It's amazing the people and how they can shape you, and it can come from any which way, and
you never know.
You never know, and the influence of one day with somebody can really have a profound impact upon you.
And that's the other thing for me. It is, I'm so lucky to be able to not travel just around Australia but also globally and meet some real icons for me. Like you guys meet someone like Professor Hans Schultz from Germany and just see this complete scary IQ that's on offer there. And these guys just are amazing. They do inspire you and sort of make you realise just how silly you really are.
Well, here's to test how silly you are. Let's.
Okay. That won't take long, Andy.
Let's go big picture. Where, I mean, obviously you're across a lot of the research. Where
Yeah.
do you think there's a real opportunity to drive the Australian or international wine industry forward for that matter?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, I mean, the good thing about research is that you start a project and often you start it with a question, but you often end up with 70 more questions than you started with. So again, I'm in the lucky position to see some of those sorts of things. But for me, I think there's a lot of opportunities around exploring some of this really exciting genetic material that's still out there. You know, I know we've locked and loaded on, you know, really, we know globally that 10 varieties cover probably about 90% of the global production in you know, around Cabernet, Shiraz, you know, Chardonnay, all that sort of stuff. But there's a lot of really exciting germplasm out there that I think we've only just sort of started to look at. And you know, if we're able to move from varietal labelling back into more, you know, house styles or whatever, I think we can really look at exploring some of that a little bit more, you know, stuff there. Because I think sometimes going out and trying to market a varietal label is fraught with danger as well. So that's one. I still think there's a lot of work around productivity research we could do. So what do I mean by that is we seem to be locked and loaded on tonnes per hectare or tonnes per acre in this industry, and I think there's a lot of scope to really push the limits on some of that. And you know, if you look at the other ag sectors, you know, they're pushing this harder all the time. And you know, the only way that you're surviving, you know, kind of inflationary pressures that have come upon us all is if you're increasing your productivity. And unless you can do that, fundamentally you're going to go backwards. So I think there's, again, a lot of opportunities around that. So 2 viticulture ones, just so you know that I'm there. And, you know, look, the other one for me is looking at the next generation of science tools that are coming in. So for me, the whole, you know, just so where we're at the moment, we're about to release a paper showing that we've sequenced the Chardonnay genome and done a genome assembly. And we've got, I think, 11 or 12 different clones that we can now identify, okay, using molecular techniques. So just seeing these tools and what they're going to do. So I reckon we're going to see a real evolution around clonal ID very soon. So, you know, and having those tests that can help, you know, determine that sort of stuff.
Because at the moment you can only identify varieties.
We can only do varieties at the moment. So really, we're getting down to that level now in some of our sequencing stuff. There, I reckon this whole AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning stuff, again, is just going to, it's going to really be scary. A little bit black box at the moment, but I think, well, you know, again, feeding data in and actually having the machine learning or AI connecting, you know, cause and effect, and really, that's really exciting to me at the moment about what they can actually do.
So the AWRI is very chemistry driven. It's very it's also microbiology driven.
Yep.
Obviously they've geared very heavily around wine and taking it all the way from the soil to the vine to the bottle. But there's something a little more obtuse that the AWRI has been working on in recent times.
It is.
In the microbiology sphere.
Yeah. So just so you know that AWRI looks after what we call our culture collection for the industry. So we have over nearly 9,000 different cultures, different strains of you know, yeast or you know, bacteria in our collection that, you know, have some influence on fermentation. So, you know, we've sequenced a lot of these. We know them back to front about their special characteristics. This one gives you low SO2. This one gives you high rose aroma. So we're doing strain development programs all the time, and we commercialise those. So part of my role is, you know, once we develop something, take that to market, and so that it's used by the Australian industry. But we had a really interesting situation, and you know, whether it's wine and fermentation, or beer and fermentation, or cider and fermentation, we've got people who are just passionate about the microbiology involved in that fermentation process. So had a situation where, just a little bit of background, there was a ship called the Sydney Cove that left Calcutta in India in 1796, I think, I apologise, or 1797, and it was sailing along under the Great Australian Bight there and started taking on water, and eventually it took on more water as it entered the rough Bass Strait area, and they actually had to run it on aground, and it sunk just off a little island off the southern end of Flinders Island called Preservation Island. And the crew tried to recover as much of the cargo, which had a lot of alcohol in it, and they pulled, and crockery and things, and it was basically one of those ships. It was one of the first merchant ships that was going to go into Sydney and sell merchandise to the new colony that was there, right? And yes, they recovered some, and there's a bit of a story about people who eventually made it to Sydney or whatever, but I guess for the focus of this particular story is that there's a fair bit of the cargo still remains in Bass Strait, in the cold waters of Bass Strait. And in 1997, a bunch of divers went there and actually did a recovery, found the wreck and recovered some artefacts, including shoes, crockery, gin and beer. And so and that actually was taken back into the museum, and it forms part of an exhibit at the museum. And it wasn't until a guy in 2016 who just started at the Queen Victoria Museum in Launceston actually said, I wonder if there's any yeast in there that are still alive. So after 220 years. And so he started to look around, and he actually approached us, given our experience, and sort of said, hey, can you guys see if you can recover any yeast or other isolates, other things that are involved in fermentation from here. So, and we did. And it's quite a complex process about doing all that. But we ended up with a strain of Saccharomyces, not the normal one. It's a different older hybrid. So we've sequenced it. We know from the libraries where it comes from, and it appears to come from ancient beer brewing over in kind of the England, in the Thames area. And there was also some Brettanomyces isolates, which Brett in wine doesn't sound so great, but Brett in beer is okay. Okay, so it's a bit different. So, and that seemed to be linked to some old strains that came from the Belgium ale area. So, yeah, it was an interesting story. So, what we have done over the last probably 2 years is essentially worked with Lion Beer Australia to develop a product and a line of James Squire. And the reason we went, why don't we go to a smaller, craftier place? We went to James Squire because, the first brewer in Australia, linked to Sydney Cove. There was a bit of a story about the link and why we selected that particular company as well. And yeah, we've been lucky enough to work with Lion Beer and Dr. Chuck Hahn and all those guys in putting a beer together, which we call the James Squire the Wreck. And it's only been launched. It was only launched back in the middle of last month. So it's only been sort of out there, and it's been for sale only through the Squire ale houses nationally at the moment. But basically, it's the first batch of kegs have sold out, and they're looking to do another one. And we're going to release a 750ml bottle for Father's Day later this year, around early September, through Dan Murphy's. And it's just been a great story of, it's not just about the performance attributes of the yeast. It's more about the story that's behind that too. And I think there's a story, and they've got wine artifacts and gin and all that sort of stuff. So we're now going to go back and explore those, and I think people really appreciate the story that's associated with that.
Oh, and it's an amazing story. It's amazing that you can actually extract some. It's the merchandise. You can extract some yeast and find a living culture in there. 220 years later, maybe it's just as well that it was run aground off preservation islands.
Exactly. Yeah.
Probably more to the point, but to actually find that living history and to be able to take that back, and that it hasn't been contaminated in any way or influenced by its surrounding environment. It's pretty amazing.
Well, we're very lucky. You're right. You're absolutely right. It's just those, where it was still waters, cool waters. These ancient beer bottles actually had a wax seal on the top, and I think that's quite rare at those times to have a beer bottle that had a wax seal. And so it was, like I said, the contents were well preserved, because often, and it was only in relatively shallow water. So obviously the further you go down, there's a whole lot of pressure issues that happen there, and there's been lots of bottles recovered from the oceans in the past with, only sort of 20 or 30 or 50 years on them, but pressure and time, degrades the cork, and you end up with a lot of seawater in those bottles, rather than some of the original content. So we're incredibly lucky. It is the world at the moment, the world's oldest surviving yeast made new, is what it says. So this is the yeast that's been recovered from some of the world's oldest beer brought back to life, basically. So
that's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, thank you for your time.
No worries, thank you.
I think it's time for us to go and find a beer.
I think it is time. I don't have any of that Shipwreck stuff here, by the way. Andy drank it all.
It's not true. It's not true. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, mate.